Hello and welcome to Bedtime History. Come in, the door is open. Settle into your favorite chair. Or pull the covers up to your chin. Let the ambient sounds of your world, the distant traffic, the hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the house settling begin to fade into the background. Tonight we will fill that silence. We are embarking on a long journey together, not to a land of myth or make-believe, but into the labyrinthine corridors of recent history, to a story so vast and so morally tangled that it has shaped the world we live in, the technology we use, and the very sky above our heads. It is a story where the brightest pinnacles of human achievement are built upon the darkest foundations of human depravity. Our story has a famous climax, a moment frozen in time and broadcast to a rapt global audience. The date is July 20th, 1969. The world, for a brief, shining moment, seems to hold its collective breath. In an era defined by division, the hot war in Vietnam, the Cold War with the Soviets, the tumultuous struggles for civil rights, humanity unites to watch a ghost-like image on a flickering screen. It's a fuzzy black and white broadcast from 250,000 miles away. A signal so faint it has to be captured by giant radio telescopes on Earth. We see a bulky figure in a pristine white suit, moving with a strange balletic slowness in an alien environment. He descends a simple metal ladder, one boot then the other. And then, a single foot presses into a soil untouched for 4.5 billion years. A voice crackling with static and cosmic distance speaks 11 words that will echo through eternity. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It is a moment of transcendent unity, of pure technological sublime. It feels like a turning point for our entire species. In Mission Control in Houston, a room of men in identical white shirts and thin black ties, the quintessential technocrats of the American century, erupts in a tidal wave of relief and joy. Cigars are lit. Tears stream down faces. The United States has won. Capitalism, democracy, and the American way of life have proven their superiority in the most dramatic arena imaginable. Hundreds of miles away, in the more sedate, academic atmosphere of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, the man who was the chief architect of this victory watches the same television images. He is Dr. Wernher von Braun, the center's charismatic and powerful director. To the American public, he is a living legend. He is the handsome, aristocratic German immigrant who escaped the clutches of tyranny to bring his singular genius to the land of opportunity. He is the friendly prophet of the space age, the man who partnered with Walt Disney in the 1950s to create a series of captivating television specials, Man in Space, Man in the Moon, Mars and Beyond, that educated and inspired millions of American families. With his infectious enthusiasm and charming German accent, he transformed the esoteric science of rocketry into a grand romantic adventure. He made the moon landing feel not just possible, but like America's manifest destiny. He is the hero of the story. But history is a palimpsest, an old manuscript on which new stories are written, but beneath which the faint traces of the old text can still be read. And beneath the triumphant narrative of the Apollo program lies an older, darker, and far more disturbing text. The story of America's journey to the moon does not begin with President Kennedy's ringing speech or the founding of NASA. It begins in the smoking ruins of the Third Reich. It begins with a secret deal, a moral compromise of staggering proportions. What if I told you that Wernher von Braun, the celebrated American hero, was not merely a German citizen caught in the maelstrom of war? What if I told you he was a member of the Nazi Party, joining in 1937, long before it was a requirement for survival? What if I told you he held a commission rank Sturmbannführer, equivalent to Major in the most monstrous organization of the 20th century, the Schutzstaffel, the SS Heinrich Himmler's black uniformed legions of death, the very organization that ran the concentration camps and implemented the Holocaust? What if I told you that the magnificent Saturn V rocket, that 36-story technological cathedral, had a direct and bloody ancestor? A weapon of terror called the V-2, also designed by von Braun. and that these V-2s were not built by proud, well-paid workers in a gleaming factory, but in a subterranean hell on Earth, a vast network of tunnels carved into a mountain, where tens of thousands of slave laborers from the Middle Badora concentration camp were worked, starved, tortured, and murdered. More human beings died building von Braun's rocket than were killed by it as a weapon. And what if I told you that von Braun was not an exception but the rule? That he was merely the most famous face of a systematic, top-secret, and deeply cynical American government program to harvest the intellectual spoils of a defeated Nazi Germany. A program that actively sought out, recruited, and methodically whitewashed the histories of over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, doctors, and technicians. Their files were scrubbed, their war crimes ignored, their fanatical devotion to Nazi ideology conveniently erased. They were spirited out of the rubble of Europe, their sins absolved with the simple click of an ordinary office supply. This was a deliberate, calculated government conspiracy, one of the most audacious and morally fraught post-World War II secrets, hidden for decades in plain sight. Its name was Operation Paperclip. Tonight, our story is not about the one small step for man. It is about the long, morally treacherous, and blood-soaked path that led to the foot of that lunar ladder. It is a story of ambition, fear, willful blindness, and a Faustian bargain made at the dawn of the nuclear age. It is the story of how America, in its existential race for survival against the Soviet Union, decided it needed Nazi brilliance to secure a free future. This is the true, unabridged history of NASA, and the chilling reality behind Operation Paperclip. Part 1: The Seeds of the Rocket. Chapter 1: The Dreamers of the Raketen Floodplatz. To understand the bargain, we must first understand the dream. Our story begins not in the halls of power, but in a dusty field on the outskirts of Berlin in the late 1920s. This was the era of the Weimar Republic, a period of incredible creative ferment and profound political instability in Germany. In this chaotic, decadent, and intellectually charged atmosphere, a group of young, brilliant, and utterly obsessed amateur rocketeers gathered. They called themselves the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, the Society for Space Travel, or VFR. They were not soldiers or munitions experts. They were dreamers. Their Bible was The Rocket into Interplanetary Space, a seminal work by the Romanian-German physicist Hermann Oberth. Their gospel was the visionary science fiction silent film, Frau im Mond, Woman in the Moon, by the great director Fritz Lang. Oberth had served as a scientific advisor on the film, and it depicted a scientifically plausible lunar mission with breathtaking accuracy for its time. It even introduced the concept of the countdown to launch, a dramatic device that would become a staple of real-life spaceflight. The charismatic heart of the VFR was a young Prussian aristocrat named Werner von Braun. Born in 1912 to Baron Magnus von Braun, a minister in the Weimar government, Werner seemed destined for a life of quiet privilege. But he was consumed by a single burning obsession: space travel. As a boy, he was a mediocre student until he discovered that the abstract worlds of calculus and physics were the keys to unlocking the secrets of the cosmos. He devoured every text he could find on rocketry. At the age of 13, he famously strapped a handful of skyrockets to a red toy wagon and sent it careening down a crowded Berlin street, a chaotic act that landed him in the custody of the local police. It was his first, but certainly not his last, rocketry experiment. The VFR leased a dusty, abandoned ammunition depot in the Berlin suburb of Reinickendorf, and audaciously christened it the Raketen Floodplatz rocket flying field. It was a place of glorious, dangerous invention. They were a motley crew of engineers, students, and enthusiasts, working with shoestring budgets. They built their early rockets, which they gave hopeful names like Mirac, Minimum Rocket, and Repulsor, from scavenged parts. They mixed volatile fuels in makeshift labs, using milk cans and scrap metal. Explosions were frequent and spectacular. Their first successful liquid-fueled rocket in 1931 rose a grand total of 60 feet. But for the members of the VFR, it might as well have been halfway to the moon. They were driven by a pure, almost boyish passion for exploration. They dreamed of weather satellites orbiting space stations and voyages to Mars and Venus. War was the furthest thing from their minds. But their timing was catastrophic. The Weimar Republic was disintegrating. The Great Depression had savaged the German economy, creating widespread unemployment and misery. The political center had collapsed, and the streets of Berlin were battlegrounds for the paramilitary wings of the Communists and the rising Nazi Party. In this environment of desperation and violence, there was no money for a group of dreamers playing with rockets. The VFR was on the verge of bankruptcy. In 1932, just as the dream seemed to be dying, salvation appeared in the form of a military uniform. Captain Walter Dornberger, a sharp, ambitious, and highly educated artillery officer in the German army, had been tasked with a peculiar mission: to investigate the military potential of liquid-fueled rockets. The Treaty of Versailles, which had ended World War I, had placed severe restrictions on Germany's ability to build and possess heavy artillery, submarines, and military aircraft. But, in a fateful oversight, it said nothing at all about rockets. Dornberger and his superiors saw a loophole, a way to rebuild German military power in secret. Dornberger visited the Raketenflugplatz. He was unimpressed by the amateurish chaos but deeply impressed by the ferocious intellect, unshakable confidence, and magnetic charisma of the 20-year-old Werner von Braun. Here was a young man who not only understood the complex physics but could also articulate a grand vision. Dornberger made von Braun an offer that would alter the course of the 20th century. He said in essence, "Your amateur games are over. Come work for the army. We will give you the resources, the facilities, the engineers, and the funding you can only dream of. All you have to do is build your rockets for us." For von Braun, this was the ultimate temptation. He was not, at his core, a political person. His ideology was rocketry. His nation was space. He saw the army not as an instrument of war and conquest, but as a wealthy and powerful patron for his research. It was the means to an end. The end for him was always the stars. He accepted. He turned his back on the joyful, open, and chaotic world of the Raketenflugplatz and entered the rigid, secretive, and disciplined world of military ordnance. The dream of peaceful exploration was now inextricably linked to the business of building weapons. It was a deal with the devil, and von Braun signed it with his eyes wide open. Chapter 2. The Devil's Uniform at Peenemünde. When Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party seized power in January 1933, the German military's interest in rocketry intensified. Hitler was a frustrated artist and architect, but he had a keen eye for technologies that promised immense power and projected a futuristic image of the Third Reich. He was enthralled by the idea of Wunderwaffen, or wonder weapons, that could terrify Germany's enemies and demonstrate Aryan superiority. The funding for von Braun's rocket program, now based at a secluded army test site called Kummersdorf, south of Berlin, grew exponentially. By the mid-1930s, the small Kummersdorf facility was no longer adequate for the scale of von Braun's ambitions. The A-2 and A-3 rockets they were developing were growing in size and power, and they needed a much larger, more isolated area for full-scale testing. He and Dornberger, now a general, needed a vast, state-of-the-art research and development center. It was von Braun's mother, a well-connected aristocrat, who suggested the perfect location. She recalled that her father used to go duck hunting on a remote, sparsely populated peninsula on the Baltic coast called Peenemünde. It was perfect, isolated from prying eyes, with a long empty coastline for test launches out into the sea. In 1937, construction began on what would become the most advanced technological research center in the world. Peenemünde was a strange paradox. It was a sprawling multi-billion Reichsmark complex with modern laboratories, massive engine test stands powerful enough to shake the ground for miles, supersonic wind tunnels, and comfortable modern housing for its thousands of scientists, engineers, and technicians. It had the feel of a high-tech university campus, a place of pure, rational scientific inquiry. Yet it was operating in the heart of a regime built on mystical blood and soil ideology, anti-intellectualism, and brute force. The Nazis distrusted Jewish physics, like Einstein's theory of relativity, but they embraced the Aryan physics that could produce a terror weapon. Here at Peenemünde, Wernher von Braun was king. As technical director, he oversaw the development of what would become the A4 rocket, the machine that would later be renamed the V-2. He was a brilliant and demanding manager, able to inspire his teams to work miracles of engineering under immense pressure. He recruited the best minds in Germany. Among them were Arthur Rudolph, a brilliant but ruthless production engineer who had been a fervent, committed Nazi since the earliest days of the party in 1931, and Kurt de Buss, a physicist and equally fanatical Nazi who would become a key launch director. To thrive and, more importantly, to secure the near-limitless funding he needed, von Braun had to navigate the treacherous internal politics of the Third Reich. He had to play the game. In 1937, he joined the Nazi Party. His membership number was 5,716,110. He would later claim he was pressured into it, that he had no choice if he wanted to continue his work. But many others in similar positions managed to avoid joining, and the evidence suggests he saw it as a necessary and beneficial career move. In 1940, his star had risen so high that he attracted the attention of the most powerful and feared man in the Reich besides Hitler himself, Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS. Himmler was a failed chicken farmer who had become the architect of the Holocaust. He was building his own industrial and military empire within the Nazi state, and he sought to control everything of importance, from policing and intelligence to industry and advanced technology. He saw von Braun's rocket program as a glittering prize to be captured from the rival German army. Himmler, a man who oozed a chilling combination of bureaucratic pedantry and mystical fanaticism, invited von Braun to his headquarters. He praised his work and made him an offer that was both a great honor and a veiled threat. He offered von Braun an honorary commission in the Allgemeine SS, the general branch of the SS. It was an offer von Braun could not refuse without making a deadly enemy. He accepted, starting as an Untersturmführer, second lieutenant. He was promoted 3 times by Himmler personally, reaching the rank of Sturmbannführer major in 1943. Von Braun would later dismiss his SS membership as a meaningless formality. He said he only wore the sinister black uniform on one occasion. He compared the commission to being made an honorary member of a university faculty. But the black uniform of the SS, with its death's head insignia, was never meaningless. It was a symbol of absolute commitment to the regime's ideology of terror, racial purity, and mass murder. Whether he was a true believer in that ideology or a supreme opportunist who would align himself with any power that could get him to the moon, the fact remains. Wernher von Braun, the future American hero, wore the uniform of the devil to get to the stars. Chapter 3. The Weapon of Vengeance and the Hell of Middlework. By 1943, the tide of the war had turned decisively against Germany. The defeat at Stalingrad was a catastrophic blow on the Eastern Front, and the Allied bombing campaign was systematically leveling German cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians and crippling war production. Hitler, increasingly isolated and delusional in his Wolf's Lair headquarters, demanded retribution. He placed his hopes in his Wunderwaffen. At Peenemünde, after years of development and many spectacular, explosive failures, von Braun's A4 rocket was finally ready. On October 3, 1942, a test rocket successfully flew 120 miles, reaching the edge of space. It was the first man-made object to enter the cosmos. General Dornberger, ecstatic, told von Braun, "Today the spaceship has been born, but it was born as a weapon." The Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, a master of cynical branding, renamed the A4 It would be called the V-2. The V stood for Virgiltongue or vengeance. It was to be the weapon that would rain fire on London, break British morale, and perhaps turn the tide of the war. The first V-2s were launched against recently liberated Paris and then London in September 1944. For the people on the receiving end, it was a new and uniquely modern form of terror. Unlike the V-1 flying bomb, a crude cruise missile whose sputtering engine gave a few terrifying seconds of warning when it cut out, the V-2 was completely silent. It traveled at more than 3,000 miles per hour, faster than the speed of sound. The first indication of an attack was the massive explosion itself, which would obliterate an entire city block. Only after the destruction was complete would the sound of the rocket's passage through the upper atmosphere arrive, a thunderous double boom that seemed to mock the victims from beyond the grave. It was a weapon of pure psychological warfare, strategically useless but technologically revolutionary. But the success of the weapon created a new and urgent problem. The sprawling above-ground facilities at Peenemünde were now a prime target for Allied bombers. In August 1943, in a daring nighttime raid codenamed Operation Hydra, the British Royal Air Force sent nearly 600 heavy bombers to attack the facility. The raid was a partial success. It damaged the plant, killed hundreds of personnel, including a key engine designer, and crucially, it convinced the Nazi leadership that production must be moved to a secure, bomb-proof location. The SS, now deeply involved in the program under the ruthless direction of General Hans Kammler, had the perfect solution. In the Harz Mountains of central Germany, near the city of Nordhausen, they had a vast network of tunnels that had been dug for a gypsum mine and were being converted for oil and chemical storage. This complex was called Mittelwerk, or Central Works. Here, protected by hundreds of feet of solid rock, V-2 production could continue 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, completely impervious to Allied bombs. But who would work in this vast, dark underground factory? The SS provided the answer to that question as well. They established a new concentration camp nearby, a subcamp of the infamous Buchenwald, which would soon become its own independent camp, Mittelbau-Dora. They filled it with prisoners from all over occupied Europe: Russians, Poles, French, Belgians, Dutch, Czechs, and Jews. These men were not workers. They were slaves deemed Untermenschen, subhumans, by the Nazi regime, and their lives were considered utterly expendable. Mittelwerk was a literal man-made hell. It was a vision out of Dante's Inferno, realized with German engineering efficiency. The prisoners were forced to live and work in the two enormous parallel main tunnels, each over a mile long, connected by 46 cross-tunnels. The air was thick with silica dust from the constant tunneling, which destroyed their lungs. The noise from the machinery was deafening, a constant, mind-numbing roar. The sanitation was non-existent. The prisoners relieved themselves in overflowing oil drums. The food was a starvation diet of watery turnip soup and a scrap of sawdust-filled bread. They slept, when they were allowed to sleep, in tiered wooden bunks crammed into the damp, cold side tunnels, often sharing a single bunk with several other sick and dying men. They were overseen by brutal SS guards and equally brutal civilian foremen, many of whom were German criminals released from prison to act as capos. The slightest infraction a moment's rest, a dropped tool, suspected sabotage was punished with savage beatings with rubber truncheons or wooden planks. Public hangings were a daily ritual, used to terrorize the workforce. Prisoners who were too weak to work were simply left to die, or were sent to be exterminated at other camps like Bergen-Belsen or Auschwitz. Of the roughly 60,000 prisoners who were forced to labor at Mittelwerk and its network of subcamps, more than 20,000 perished. That is a death rate of 1 in 3. The man in charge of production in this charnel house, the man who made the factory run, was Arthur Rudolph, von Braun's brilliant and utterly ruthless production chief. Rudolph was an early and ardent Nazi, a true believer. He drove the slave laborers with merciless efficiency, pushing them to meet Hitler's insane production quotas of 900 rockets per month. And where was Wernher von Braun in this picture? He and his defenders would later construct a careful narrative of ignorance and powerlessness. He was a pure scientist, they claimed, a distant researcher who was horrified by the conditions but was unable to do anything about them, as the camp was run by the SS. The historical record tells a very different, and much more damning story. Von Braun's office was moved from the idyllic Baltic coast to be closer to Mittelwerk. He visited the underground factory on multiple occasions. He walked through the tunnels. He saw the emaciated, ghost-like figures of the slave laborers in their striped uniforms. He could not have been unaware of the stench of death and misery. More than that, there is documentary evidence of his active involvement. There are signed documents in which he personally consulted on the design and layout of the factory. There are records of him being present at meetings where the procurement of more slave laborers from the main camp at Buchenwald was discussed and approved. He was not a passive observer. He was an active participant in a system of industrialized murder for the sake of technological advancement. The V-2 rockets that rose into the sky, the direct ancestors of the Saturn V, were built on a mountain of corpses. In a strange and revealing incident, von Braun himself was arrested by the Gestapo in March 1944. Himmler, still jockeying for full control of the program, had him and two of his colleagues imprisoned on trumped-up charges of defeatism. The charge was that von Braun was more focused on space exploration than on winning the war, a fact that was undoubtedly true. It was likely an internal power play. His commander, General Dornberger, had to personally appeal to Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, and even to Hitler himself to get him released. Dornberger argued that without von Braun the V-2 program would collapse. This incident would later be cynically used by von Braun and his American defenders as proof that he was anti-Nazi. The reality is far more complex. He was an indispensable asset caught in a vicious turf war between two powerful factions of the same monstrous regime. Part 2: The Spoils of War. Chapter 4: The Hunt for the Black List. By the spring of 1945, the end was near. The Third Reich, which was supposed to last for 1,000 years, was collapsing into a nightmare of fire and retribution after only 12. Amidst the chaos of crumbling fronts and desperate last stands, a second clandestine war was being fought. It was a frantic, high-stakes treasure hunt. The Americans, the British, and the Soviets were not just racing for territory. They were racing for Germany's intellectual crown jewels. Its scientists, its engineers, and its technological secrets. Both sides had black lists of high-value targets. These were the men who held the keys to the next generation of warfare. Jet aircraft, guided missiles, advanced submarines, and most terrifyingly nuclear physics and rocketry. At the very top of every list was Wernher von Braun and the entire senior leadership of the V-2 program. The American effort was a complex patchwork of competing intelligence units. The most famous was the Alsos mission, a team of scientists and soldiers led by the charismatic Colonel Boris Pash, tasked with a single overriding objective: to seize all elements of the German nuclear research program before the Soviets could get their hands on them. They were hunting for physicists like Werner Heisenberg and Otto Hahn. But hot on their heels, and sometimes in direct competition with them, were technical intelligence teams from the Army Ordnance Corps. These teams were led by men like Colonel Holger Toftoy, the far-sighted chief of the Ordnance Rocket Branch. Toftoy was not a scientist, but he understood with ice-cold clarity that the V-2 was not just another weapon. It was a revolution. He knew that long-range ballistic missiles, eventually armed with atomic bombs, would be the ultimate arbiter of power in the post-war world. His man on the ground in Europe, a young, aggressive, and relentless intelligence officer named Major Robert Staver, was given a simple, urgent mission: find the V-2 scientists, secure their research, and get them before the Russians do. Von Braun, the ultimate pragmatist, had already made his choice. He and his team feared and despised the Soviets, whom they saw as Asiatic barbarians. They knew that capture by the Red Army would mean a one-way trip to Siberia. He saw the Americans, on the other hand, as a business opportunity. In a secret meeting with his top 50 engineers at Piemont in the winter of 1945, he laid out the options. "Germany has lost the war," he stated flatly. "The question now is, to whom shall we surrender?" He argued that the Americans, with their immense industrial capacity, their financial resources, and a culture he perceived as more forward-thinking and less scarred by the war, were the only patrons capable of financing his ultimate dream of spaceflight. The decision was unanimous. In a carefully planned and audacious exodus, von Braun orchestrated the flight of his inner circle. He used his authority and influence to convince the SS to evacuate 500 of his key personnel from the advancing Red Army, ostensibly moving them to a secure location in the Alps to continue their work. He also arranged for the program's most vital asset, 14 tons of priceless technical blueprints, research documents, and test data to be loaded onto trucks. He ordered his trusted aides to drive the documents deep into the Harz Mountains and hide them in an abandoned, flooded mine shaft near the town of Dornten, away from the prying eyes of the SS. This was the complete intellectual history of the V-2, the culmination of a decade of work worth billions. Then von Braun and his core team made their way south, on a chaotic journey through the wreckage of collapsing Germany, to Bavaria. They positioned themselves in a region they knew from radio broadcasts would be captured by the Americans. They took over a small ski resort in the picturesque town of Oberammergau and waited for the war to end. In the first days of May 1945, with Hitler having committed suicide in his Berlin bunker and the war in Europe officially over, von Braun sent his younger brother Magnus, who was an engineer himself and spoke fluent English, down the mountain on a bicycle to make contact. After a few false starts, Magnus flagged down a bewildered American GI from the 44th Infantry Division, Private First Class Fred Schneekert. "My name is Magnus von Braun," he announced dramatically. "My brother invented the V-2. We want to surrender." For Major Staver and Colonel Toftoy, who were frantically searching for the team, it was as if the Holy Grail had just been delivered to their doorstep. They had won the race for the scientists. Chapter 5. The Great Rocket Heist of Thuringia. But capturing the men was only half the battle. The hardware and, more importantly, the hidden documents were another matter entirely. The Mittelwerk factory, the nearby Dora concentration camp, and the city of Nordhausen were in the region of Thuringia. And according to the Allied agreements made at the Yalta Conference, Thuringia was destined to become part of the Soviet occupation zone. The American forces who had captured the area were scheduled to withdraw at the end of June 1945. They had a window of only a few weeks to plunder the site. What followed was one of the most audacious and consequential acts of looting in military history. Colonel Toftoy, now promoted to the head of Ordnance Technical Intelligence in Paris, orchestrated a massive, frantic logistical heist. He declared the Nordhausen area a top-priority military zone, codenamed Special Mission V-2. Under the noses of the Soviets, who were watching from just a few miles away, a fleet of U.S. Army trucks roared into the Mittelwerk complex day and night. An entire special railway company was diverted to the task. They hauled away enough captured V-2 components, engines, guidance systems, fuel tanks, airframes to assemble roughly 100 complete rockets. It was a Herculean effort. They stripped the underground factory bare. Simultaneously, Major Staver's team, after intensely interrogating von Braun's key engineers, zeroed in on the location of the hidden documents. They found the abandoned mine shaft near Dornten. The entrance was blocked by a landslide. They brought in engineers to blast it open. Inside, they found a treasure trove, 340 tons of documents and hardware, including the 14 tons of priceless blueprints and research data that von Braun had hidden. This was the intellectual heart of the program. Everything, the rocket parts and the documents, was loaded onto trains and shipped hundreds of miles west, across the temporary border into the American zone of occupation in Hesse. By July 1st, when the American troops officially withdrew and the Red Army rolled in to claim their prize, they found an empty factory and a cleaned-out mine shaft. The Soviets were furious. They had been outmaneuvered. The first major battle of the Cold War had been won by the Americans, not with guns, but with deception, logistical might, and a healthy dose of audacity. The assets that would one day take America to the moon were now securely in their hands. Chapter 6. The Bureaucratic Alchemy of Operation Paperclip. The captured German scientists were gathered at a collection center in Garmisch-Partenkirchen and later in a fenced-in compound near Landshut, Bavaria, which they nicknamed Camp Overcast. They were interrogated at length by British and American intelligence officers. Their immense value was immediately apparent. The initial plan, codenamed Operation Overcast, was modest. It called for bringing about 100 of the top scientists to the United States on temporary 6-month contracts. They would help the U.S. Army understand and replicate their technology, and then they would be returned to a democratic, rebuilding Germany. But the dawning reality of the Cold War quickly rendered this plan obsolete. The world of 1945 was rapidly changing. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union had fractured. An Iron Curtain, in Winston Churchill's famous phrase, was descending across Europe. The Soviets, having captured the scraps of the V-2 program and thousands of lower-level German technicians, were aggressively building their own missile program under the direction of a brilliant engineer named Sergei Korolev. American military leaders, particularly in the Army and the Army Air Forces, came to a stark conclusion: letting these scientists go was unthinkable. They were strategic assets of incalculable value. They couldn't be allowed to return to Germany, where they might be kidnapped by Soviet agents or tempted by lucrative offers from other nations. America didn't just need their past knowledge. It needed their future genius, working exclusively for the United States. This led to the creation of a new, expanded, and much more secretive program. But there was a formidable roadblock. President Harry S. Truman. Truman was a man with a strong moral compass. Still reeling from the newsreels showing the horrors of the newly liberated concentration camps, he was determined that the United States would not become a haven for war criminals. On September 4, 1945, he issued a formal directive authorizing the program to bring German specialists to the U.S. for the long term. But he included a clause, a moral line in the sand, born of the fresh horrors of Dachau and Buchenwald. The directive explicitly forbade the immigration of any individual who shall be found to have been a member of the Nazi Party, and more than a nominal participant in its activities, or an active supporter of Nazism or militarism. This directive should have been a death blow to the project. Wernher von Braun, the SS major, Arthur Rudolph, the slave driver of Mittelwerk, Kurt Debus, the fanatical Nazi and SA stormtrooper, Dr. Hubertus Strughold, the aviation medicine expert whose subordinates had tortured prisoners to death at Dachau, they were all, by any reasonable definition, far more than nominal participants in the Nazi regime. Their own intelligence files, compiled by the U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps (CIC) in Germany, were filled with damning evidence of their enthusiastic Nazism, and, in some cases, their direct involvement in war crimes. Faced with this moral and legal dilemma, the officials at the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, an interagency group created to manage the program, and their allies in the Pentagon, made a fateful and deeply cynical decision. If the facts didn't fit the policy, they would change the facts. They would not give up their scientific prizes. They would conspire to circumvent the express orders of their own president and the laws of their country. This was the birth of the conspiracy that would be codenamed Operation Paperclip. The name was chillingly literal and bureaucratic. The program was run by a man named Bosket Wev at the Department of Commerce. When the JIOA wanted to bring a scientist to America, they had to submit his security file to the State Department for visa approval. The JOA officers knew that the unvarnished files of men like Rudolph or D. Buss would be instantly rejected by the scrupulous officials at the State Department. So, they began to perform a kind of bureaucratic alchemy. They would take the thick file of a desirable scientist, with all its damning evidence collected by their own CIC agents, and they would write a new sanitized summary. This new summary would omit SS memberships, downplay party affiliations as mere careerism, joined to keep his job, and reframe complicity in war crimes as being forced to work for the regime or even as a form of subtle resistance. Then this new false summary would be attached to the front of the original incriminating file with a simple, ordinary paperclip. The paperclip became a secret signal. It told the officials at the State and Justice Departments, who were often overwhelmed with paperwork and predisposed to trust the military's judgment on matters of national security, to ignore the thick, damning file underneath and just read the clean summary on top. It was a marker for a deliberate lie, a bureaucratic tool for whitewashing history. Let's look at the specific case of Arthur Rudolph. His original 1945 CIC intelligence file stated, 100% Nazi, dangerous type security threat. Suggests internment. This was a clear red flag. But his new paperclip summary, written by the JOA, painted a very different picture. It described him as having no Nazi sympathies, and claimed he had been forced to work at the Mittelwerk factory. Paperclip. Approved. Kurt D. Buss's file detailed his fervent Nazism, his early membership in both the SS and the SA stormtroopers, and an allegation from a credible source that he had reported a colleague to the Gestapo for making anti-Nazi remarks. His paperclip summary erased all of it, presenting him simply as a brilliant physicist with no political leanings. Paperclip. Approved. Dr. Hubertus Strughold would later be celebrated in America as the father of space medicine, for his pioneering work on the physiological effects of spaceflight. His new life in America conveniently obscured the fact that his name was deeply entangled with the gruesome high-altitude and freezing experiments conducted on prisoners at the Dachau concentration camp. Scientists under his direct authority at the Luftwaffe's Institute for Aviation Medicine placed inmates in low-pressure chambers to simulate high altitudes, watching as they died in agony from the bends or exploded lungs. Others were submerged in vats of ice water until they froze to death, their final moments carefully recorded. While Strughold's direct participation was debated, he was the head of the institute where these atrocities took place. He knew. His file was clipped. He was approved. Over and over again for hundreds of scientists the process was repeated. The JIOA and the military systematically conspired to subvert the will of their own government. It was a breathtaking act of deception, and it was all justified by a single overriding fear: the looming threat of the Soviet Union. The Cold War, they argued to themselves and to each other, was a new kind of total war, a war of ideologies and technologies, and it required a new, more pragmatic kind of morality. Justice for past crimes was a luxury they believed America could not afford. Part 3. A New World. Chapter 7. The Desert Exiles of Fort Bliss. In late 1945, the first group of 118 German scientists, led by Wernher von Braun, boarded a transport ship for America. They were told they were going to New York City and would be treated as wards of the Army. They landed in Delaware and were promptly put on a sealed train. They traveled for days, their excitement turning to bewilderment as the lush green landscape of the East Coast gave way to the endless, sun-baked emptiness of the American Southwest. Their destination was Fort Bliss, an enormous and desolate army post outside El Paso, Texas. They were given the darkly ironic nickname, the Prisoners of Peace. They were housed in Spartan, dilapidated wooden barracks that had recently been used for Italian and German prisoners of war. The barracks were infested with scorpions and centipedes. They were initially kept under close guard, their mail was censored, and they were not allowed to leave the base without an escort. The culture shock was profound. These men, many of whom were from educated, aristocratic backgrounds and were accustomed to the green, rolling hills of Bavaria, were now in a world of dust, cactus, and relentless oppressive sun. The local cuisine was another shock. They were baffled by chili, tacos, and the unfamiliar sweetness of American bread. Their work consisted of painstakingly reassembling the V-2 rockets they had built for Hitler and teaching American GIs and engineers from the General Electric Company how to handle, fuel, and launch them. The launch site was another 100 miles to the north, across the New Mexico border, at the newly established White Sands Proving Ground, later Missile Range. It was a vast, empty expanse of desert, a perfect place to fire rockets without hitting anything of value. The atmosphere on the project was tense and surreal. Many of the American soldiers and engineers working alongside them were veterans of the bloody European theater. Some were Jewish Americans who had lost family in the Holocaust. Now they were expected to be professional colleagues with the very men who had served the regime that had perpetrated those crimes. The Germans, for their part, often displayed a galling lack of remorse. One of the German scientists, when asked by a journalist how he felt about his rocket being used to kill thousands of civilians in London, infamously quipped, with a chilling lack of irony, "The rocket worked perfectly except for landing on the wrong planet." This gallows humor did little to ease the tension. For Wernher von Braun, these 5 years in the desert were a period of deep and gnawing frustration. He felt he and his team, the world's preeminent rocket experts, were being treated like museum pieces. They were curators of their old technology rather than pioneers of the new. The Army's interest seemed limited to simply learning how the V-2 worked. Their grand dreams of multi-stage rockets, orbiting space stations, and voyages to Mars seemed more distant than ever. They were firing old V-2s into the empty desert sky, a far cry from the lunar ambitions that fueled them. The FBI, meanwhile, kept a close watch on them, monitoring their activities and their political leanings, deeply suspicious of their past loyalties. They were a Formula One racing team being asked to tune up old Model T Fords, and they were growing restless. But they waited, they worked, and they bided their time, confident that their moment would come. Chapter 8. Rocket City, USA. In 1950, the fortunes of von Braun's team changed dramatically. The outbreak of the Korean War in June of that year, combined with the Soviet Union's successful test of an atomic bomb in 1949, convinced the Pentagon that it needed a powerful, permanent ballistic missile program to counter the growing Soviet threat. The Army decided to consolidate its burgeoning rocketry efforts and move them from the remote desert of Texas to a new permanent home. The chosen location was an old chemical weapons facility in the Deep South, Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. Huntsville at the time was a sleepy, provincial southern town. Its economy was based on cotton and watercress. It was a place of deep social conservatism, racial segregation, and quiet tradition. The arrival of von Braun and his team, which had now grown to include hundreds of German scientists and their families, who were being brought over from Germany as part of Operation Paperclip, would transform it forever. Huntsville became Rocket City, USA. The Germans, no longer prisoners but now valued government employees on a path to citizenship, began to build new lives. They bought land and constructed modern, suburban homes in a new development they wryly named Sherwood Forest. Their children, who quickly learned English with perfect American accents, were enrolled in the local segregated schools, where their academic prowess often astonished their teachers. The Germans became a powerful force for social and cultural change in the town. They were instrumental in desegregating the local golf course, establishing a symphony orchestra, and founding the University of Alabama in Huntsville. They were seen by the local population as eccentric, brilliant, and a welcome boon to the local economy. Their Nazi pasts were something of an open secret, a subject of quiet rumor and gossip, but in the patriotic anti-communist fervor of the 1950s, it was a secret most were willing to keep. These men were no longer seen as former enemies. They were now America's secret weapon in the Cold War. Beneath the surface of this idyllic picture of immigrant assimilation, in the secure fenced-in confines of Redstone Arsenal, the German team was hard at work building the weapons that would form the backbone of America's nuclear deterrent. They developed the PGM-11 Redstone missile, America's first reliable, large-scale ballistic missile. It was a direct and clear descendant of the V-2, but with significant improvements including a detachable warhead. This was followed by the Jupiter missile, an even more powerful intermediate-range ballistic missile. It was during this period that Wernher von Braun, the master persuader and publicist, came into his own. He understood that to achieve his ultimate dream of space exploration, he needed more than just military contracts. He needed to capture the imagination, and thus the political will, of the American people. He found the perfect collaborator in the master of American imagination himself, Walt Disney. In the mid-1950s, von Braun became the star and chief scientific consultant for a series of hugely popular television specials for Disney's Tomorrowland series. With his charismatic smile, his infectious passion, and his authoritative German accent, he became America's trusted guide to the cosmos. He laid out a clear, compelling, and visually stunning roadmap for the future. A reusable winged space shuttle, a giant rotating wheel of a space station to overcome weightlessness, and a fleet of chemically powered ships for a grand voyage to Mars. Millions of American families, gathered around their small black and white television sets, were enthralled. They saw a brilliant visionary, a prophet of a better future. They did not see a former SS major. The paperclip conspiracy was working perfectly. Part 4. The Race to the Heavens. Chapter 9. The Beeping Sphere and a Nation's Humiliation. On October 4, 1957, the world changed in the time it takes for a small metal sphere to complete one orbit of the Earth. A faint, steady beeping sound, picked up by amateur radio operators around the globe, announced that the Soviet Union had successfully launched Sputnik 1, the world's first artificial satellite. The news hit the United States like a technological Pearl Harbor. The beeping of that tiny 184-pound polished sphere was a constant orbiting taunt, a symbol of Soviet technological superiority that shattered America's post-war confidence. It sparked a wave of national panic, self-doubt, and outright hysteria. The media screamed about a missile gap, claiming the Soviets had a massive lead in ballistic missile technology. Senate Majority Leader Lyndon B. Johnson called it a week of shame and warned of Soviet control of the high ground of space. Schools across the nation rushed to beef up their science and math curricula, fearing that American students had grown soft and lazy. The space race had begun, and America was humiliatingly, terrifyingly losing. In Washington, there was chaos and finger-pointing. The official U.S. satellite program, Project Vanguard, run by the Naval Research Laboratory, was a disaster. It was meant to be a purely civilian, peaceful satellite, launched by a non-military rocket, to distinguish it from the Army's missile program. In December 1957, in front of a live international television audience gathered at Cape Canaveral, the Vanguard rocket ignited, rose about 4 feet off the launch pad, shuddered, and then collapsed back onto itself in a spectacular fireball. The newspapers mockingly dubbed it Flopnik, Kaputnik, and Stayputnik. America's prestige had hit rock bottom. All eyes, filled with desperation, turned to Huntsville, Alabama. For years, Wernher von Braun and his Army team had been pushing to be allowed to launch a satellite with their Jupiter-C rocket, a modified Redstone. But they had been repeatedly denied, partly because of intense inter-service rivalry with the Navy and the Air Force, and partly because of a deep-seated desire in Washington for the first American satellite to be launched by a 100% American team, not by former Nazis. Now, in the depths of national humiliation, those reservations evaporated. The von Braun team was given the green light. In a frantic 84-day push, they prepared their rocket and a small pencil-shaped satellite, designed by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California. On the cold, Clear night of January 31, 1958, the Jupiter-C rocket, renamed Juno I for the launch, thundered into the Florida sky. Tense minutes passed in the control bunker. Then the signal was confirmed from a tracking station in California. Explorer 1 was in orbit. The bunker erupted in celebration. At a hastily called press conference in Washington, D.C., a triumphant Wernher von Braun held a full-scale model of the satellite aloft alongside Dr. William Pickering of JPL and Dr. James Van Allen of the University of Iowa, who had designed the scientific instrument aboard. The men from Piedmont had saved America's pride. Explorer 1 would go on to make the first major scientific discovery of the space age, identifying the radiation belts around the Earth that now bear Van Allen's name. Chapter 10. The Cathedral of Power Building the Saturn V. The Sputnik crisis was a wake-up call that led directly to the creation of a new, powerful civilian agency in 1958, charged with a single clear mission: to organize America's space efforts and win the space race against the Soviets. This was the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. In 1960, a historic transfer took place. The entire Army Ballistic Missile Agency at the Redstone Arsenal, its world-class facilities, its 4,670 personnel, and its director Wernher von Braun was absorbed, lock, stock, and barrel into the new agency. They became NASA's George C. Marshall Space Flight Center. The former chief rocket weapons designer for the Third Reich was now one of the most powerful and important figures in the U.S. government's most prestigious scientific endeavor. On May 25, 1961, the stakes were raised to an almost unimaginable level. The new young president, John F. Kennedy, stood before a joint session of Congress and declared that America should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. It was an audacious, breathtaking challenge, a political masterstroke designed to galvanize the nation and leapfrog the Soviets. The task of building the impossible machine to get there fell to von Braun's team at the Marshall Space Flight Center. To send 3 men to the moon, a journey of 500,000 miles, and bring them back safely, they needed to build a rocket of a size and power that bordered on science fiction. The result was the Saturn V. The Saturn V was not a mere machine. It was a technological cathedral. It was the physical manifestation of a nation's will. It stood 363 feet tall, higher than the Statue of Liberty. Fully fueled with over 1 million gallons of cryogenic propellants, it weighed over 6 million pounds. Its first stage was powered by 5 F1 engines, the most powerful single-chamber liquid-fueled engines ever built. Each one was the size of a small car and generated 1.5 million pounds of thrust. Together, at liftoff, the 5 F1s produced 7.5 million pounds of thrust and burned 15 tons of fuel per second. The sound of a Saturn V launch was not just a sound. It was a physical force, a primal roar that registered on seismographs, a shockwave that could be felt in the chest for miles around. The development of this behemoth, with its 3 million individual parts, was a testament to von Braun's genius as a manager and systems engineer. He oversaw a nationwide effort involving 20,000 contractors and 400,000 people. But it was also the ultimate vindication for the men of Operation Paperclip. The leadership of the Saturn V project read like a who's who of Piedmont veterans. Arthur Rudolph, the former director of the slave labor factory at Middlework, was the project director for the Saturn V rocket itself. He was in charge of the entire program, a position of immense power and prestige. Kurt Debus, the former fanatical Nazi and SS officer, became the first director of the Kennedy Space Center and was responsible for all launch operations. Dieter Grau, Hans Maus, Eberhard Ries, the list went on. The men who had built weapons of terror for Hitler were now building the vehicle that would carry the American flag to the moon. The triumph was absolute. The Saturn V is the only launch vehicle in history with a perfect flight record. Every single one of its 13 launches was a success. From the first unmanned test in 1967, which shook the CBS News studio and caused ceiling tiles to fall on Walter Cronkite's head, to the final flight carrying the Skylab space station in 1973, the rocket performed flawlessly. It was and remains a masterpiece of engineering, a symbol of what humanity can achieve when it puts its collective mind to a single audacious goal. And on July 20, 1969, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the Sea of Tranquility, it was the fulfillment of Wernher von Braun's 50-year obsession. It was a victory made possible by his unwavering vision, his brilliant management, and the dark secret bargain he had made so many years before. The ends, it seemed to the entire watching world, had spectacularly, undeniably justified the means. Part 5: The Long Shadow of the Past. Chapter 11. The ghosts of Dora begin to speak. But history has a long and patient memory, and justice, though often delayed, has a way of seeking the light. As the euphoria of the Apollo program faded in the 1970s, and the nation grappled with the disillusionment of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal, a new generation of journalists, historians, and politicians began to look at the past with a more critical eye. They were unburdened by the existential fears of the early Cold War, and less willing to accept the sanitized official narratives. Whispers about the Nazi pasts of NASA's heroes grew into articles and books. French journalist Jean-Michel produced a documentary called De Nuremberg à la Lune, From Nuremberg to the Moon. In 1978, a book by investigative author Linda Hunt, Secret Agenda, began to expose the full, sordid details of the paperclip cover-up. She used the Freedom of Information Act to unearth previously classified documents that laid bare the systematic deception. In Congress, a determined young representative from Brooklyn named Elizabeth Holtzman began to push for action against Nazi war criminals living in the United States. The political climate was changing. The argument that these men were indispensable to national security no longer held the same power it once did. The dam finally broke in 1979 with the creation of the Office of Special Investigations, OSI, within the Criminal Division of the Department of Justice. The OSI's mission was simple and stark: to identify, investigate, and take legal action to denaturalize and/or deport Nazi war criminals who had found a safe haven in the United States. Its investigators and lawyers, led by determined men like Alan Ryan and later Eli Rosenbaum, were not swayed by arguments about a scientist's contribution to the space race. They were interested in one thing: accountability. Inevitably, their investigation led them to the celebrated heroes of Huntsville. It led them to the neatly clipped files of Operation Paperclip. Chapter 12. The Case of Arthur Rudolph, A Reckoning. The OSI's most high-profile, explosive, and consequential case was that of Arthur Rudolph. By the early 1980s, Rudolph was a revered figure in the pantheon of the American space program. He had retired from NASA in 1969, shortly before the first moon landing, having received the agency's highest honor, the NASA Distinguished Service Medal. He was a naturalized U.S. citizen, living a comfortable and affluent life in San Jose, California, and collecting a generous government pension. He was, to all the world, the father of the Saturn V. The OSI investigators, however, saw a different man. They did what no one in the U.S. government had dared to do for nearly 4 decades. They went back to the primary sources. They dug up the original pre-paperclip intelligence files from the Army's archives. They found the CIC documents that called him a 100% Nazi and a security threat. They unearthed his application for a job at a Luftwaffe facility where he proudly detailed his long and active history in the Nazi Party. Crucially, they went beyond the paper trail. They traveled to Europe and tracked down the few remaining survivors of the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. They took sworn, videotaped testimony from men who had witnessed Rudolph's brutality firsthand. They described him not as a reluctant bystander, but as a ruthless, ever-present master of the slave system. They recalled him walking the factory floor with a stick, wearing civilian clothes but radiating an authority more terrifying than that of the SS guards. They testified that he was directly responsible for ordering hangings and savage beatings for suspected sabotage. The OSI compiled a mountain of evidence that directly implicated him in war crimes. In 1982, two OSI investigators confronted Rudolph at his home in San Jose. For hours they questioned him. At first he was defiant, sticking to the sanitized story he had told for decades. But as the investigators presented him with the damning evidence, the documents, the survivor testimonies, his composure began to crack. He admitted to being present at hangings. He admitted he knew the workers were slaves. Rudolph, now in his late 70s, was faced with a devastating choice. Face a public, televised war crimes trial that would not only destroy his own reputation and legacy, but would also forever tarnish the golden image of NASA and the Apollo program, or quietly surrender. He chose to cut a deal. In November 1983, after long negotiations, he signed an agreement with the Justice Department. In it, he agreed to renounce his hard-won American citizenship and leave the United States forever. In return, the U.S. government would not formally prosecute him for war crimes, and he would be allowed to keep his generous NASA pension. In March 1984, Arthur Rudolph and his wife left the United States for Germany. The news of his departure and the reasons for it sent shockwaves through Huntsville, where many of his old colleagues and friends still lived. They were outraged. They saw him as a hero who was being persecuted by overzealous bureaucrats, a victim of a historical witch hunt. They mounted a campaign to defend his honor. But for the rest of the world, the Rudolph case ripped the cover off the sanitized history of the space program. The government conspiracy known as Operation Paperclip was no longer a secret. Rudolph himself, upon arriving in Germany, was hailed as a martyr by right-wing and neo-Nazi groups. He never showed a shred of remorse, insisting to the end of his life in 1996 that he had done nothing wrong, and that the prisoners at Mittelwerk were common criminals and saboteurs. The Rudolph case was the tip of the iceberg. Other paperclip scientists were investigated. The dark past of Hubert de Strughold and his connection to the Dachau experiments was fully exposed, leading to his name being posthumously stripped from the Aerospace Medical Library at Brooks Air Force Base that had been dedicated in his honor. The fairy tale was well and truly over. The heartwarming story of the brilliant apolitical scientists who came to America to build a brighter future was replaced by the much darker, more accurate story of a nation that knowingly imported, protected, and celebrated men who were complicit in some of the worst crimes in human history. Conclusion: the unresolvable shadow of the rocket. So what then, after this long and tortuous journey, is the ultimate legacy of Operation Paperclip? It is a legacy of profound, unsettling, and perhaps ultimately irresolvable duality. It is, without question, a story of monumental achievement. The science and technology these men brought to America propelled the nation to the moon, a feat that still stands as one of humanity's greatest accomplishments. Their work was instrumental in establishing America's military and technological supremacy during the Cold War, arguably preventing a Third World War. It laid the foundation for much of our modern world, from satellite communications and GPS that guide our cars and phones, to weather forecasting that saves countless lives, to the advanced medical technology that has extended our lifespans. Wernher von Braun was a visionary genius. His team performed engineering miracles. That is an undeniable historical fact. But it is also, with equal certainty, a story of catastrophic moral failure. It is the story of a nation that, in a moment of great fear and great ambition, chose to betray the very principles of justice and human rights it had just fought a world war to defend. The United States went to war to defeat a monstrous regime built on racism, totalitarianism, and mass murder. And then, as soon as the war was over, it secretly welcomed hundreds of men who were willing servants and, in some cases, active agents of that regime. It washed the blood from their hands, put their brilliant minds to work, and then lied to its own citizens and to the world for decades about who these men really were. It chose technological advantage over justice, national security over moral consistency. The story of Operation Paperclip forces us to live in the uncomfortable space of contradiction. It compels us to ask questions that have no easy answers. Can you or should you separate the work from the man? Can we admire the elegant power and beauty of the Saturn V rocket while acknowledging the blood that stained the hands of its chief architect? Does the giant leap for mankind somehow atone for, or even mitigate, the crimes committed against humanity in the dark, stinking tunnels of Middlework? Operation Paperclip is a stark and enduring reminder that history is not a clean, simple narrative of good versus evil. It is a messy, complex, and morally ambiguous terrain. The heroes of our grandest national myths often have pasts we would rather not inspect too closely. The gleaming white rocket of Apollo, that shining symbol of American triumph and human aspiration, will forever cast a long dark shadow, a shadow that stretches all the way back through the decades, across the Atlantic Ocean, to a desolate island in the Baltic and the subterranean hell of a German mountain. It is the shadow of the V-2. It is the shadow of Middle Badora. It is the shadow of a government conspiracy. It is the shadow of a Faustian bargain whose terms we, as a nation and as a species, are still struggling to comprehend. Thank you for embarking on this long and difficult journey with us tonight. The story of Operation Paperclip, this epic tale of post-World War II secrets and a government's calculated compromises, is not just about NASA history. It's about the very soul of a nation and the complex, often contradictory, nature of human progress itself. What do you believe? Was this a necessary evil, a pragmatic choice in a dangerous world? Or was it an unforgivable moral stain that can never be erased? We invite you to continue the conversation in the comments below. Your thoughts and perspectives are what bring these stories to life. If you believe, as we do, that history is found not in the simple answers but in the most difficult and challenging questions, please support our work by liking this video and subscribing to Bedtime History. There are so many more shadows to explore, so many more hidden stories to tell. Be sure to click that notification bell so you won't miss our next descent into the fascinating and often unsettling truths of our past. And if you have a friend who understands that the most compelling stories are the ones that challenge us, the ones that linger in the mind long after they are told, please share this episode. Your support is our fuel. Until next time, try to have peaceful dreams, and as you look up at the moon, remember the long, dark, and complicated road we took to get there.